Blessed love and greetings, friends, colleagues, artists, and global family. I am so honored and humbled to be invited to deliver this keynote address. It's been a while since I've exercised my public speaking muscle, so this invitation to step out of my comfort zone is a gift and a privilege and a beautiful invitation for growth. Give thanks. Today I will be speaking about healing and justice, but I cannot speak about this without addressing the ongoing colonial violence faced by Indigenous nations across this continent. Before I begin, I would like us all to honor those whose lives were forcibly taken at the hands of the church, government, and RCMP through the residential school system. Those who died in the schools, and those whose lives were taken as a result of the trauma of surviving horrific violence. Let's do this now with a moment of silence. Colonial violence is ongoing. Although moments of silence are ways to honor and remember, action is needed to make change. So I ask all fellow settlers, arrivants, and displaced peoples on this land to commit to solidarity action. If you have not yet done so, educate yourself on the Indian Act and why it needs to be abolished. Read and familiarize yourself with the 94 calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Learn about the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People, aka UNDRIP. Listen to Indigenous leaders and follow their calls to action. Support Indigenous land and water protectors. The protection is for the benefit of us all. If it's available to you, please contribute to the Indian Residential School Survivor Society. It's really easy to sign up on their website at irsss.ca to make a one-time or monthly donation. Justice requires us to take care of each other. Our liberation is collective. So for those who are meeting me for the first time, my name is Naomi Grace Child, or as some know me by my artist handle, Naomi Grace. I am an interdisciplinary artist, intersectional activist, anti-racism educator, and medicine maker, born and currently residing on the illegally occupied territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, colonially referred to as Vancouver, BC, Canada. My paternal ancestors were from the African continent. The names, languages, and customs of our people were forcibly stolen from us while we were held hostage under slavery in what are referred to today as Grenada and Guyana, lands stolen and occupied by the Spanish and British from the Kalinango, Lokono, and Taino peoples. My ancestors survived unspeakable, horrific violence in forced labor camps referred to as plantations. Families were ripped apart, babies torn away from their mothers, their blood and sweat stolen to enforce genocide, colonize land occupied by their enslavers, and build the wealth of the British Empire, the same empire that created so-called Canada. Their strength, ingenuity, and resilience lives on in me. Stolen people and stolen identities on stolen land. My maternal ancestors were farming people who came to Turtle Island from Ireland and Eastern Europe, but left their cultures and their cultural identities behind on the European continent over 150 years ago to assimilate under the moniker of Canadian and colonize illegally occupied lands to build the wealth of the British Empire. They came here as settlers with the promise of a better life, but the truth was kept from them. The land was already settled, and their presence here was at the expense of the lives of those whose lands they occupied. Rejected roots and assumed supremacy on stolen land. My African ancestors show themselves on my face. My kinky hair, my brown skin, my thick lips, my broad nose, and my dark eyes. When I look at myself in the mirror, there is no mistaking who they are and who I am. As the late, great Peter Tosh sang, "Don't care where you come from, as long as you're a black man, you're an African." I'm a woman, but the sentiment still stands. My mother sponsored my father's migration from stolen land to stolen land in the late 1970s. I was born on these lands that are the ancestral lands of neither boughs of my family tree, but this is the only home I've ever known, despite the constant messages that I do not belong and am unwanted because of my blackness. I am acutely aware of the parallels between the colonial violence resisted by my African ancestors and my community today, and the ongoing colonial violence survived and resisted by Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island and across the globe. My relationship to this land is complex. My relationship to my ancestral lands is complex. My relationship to my sense of home, complex. My relationship to myself and my intersecting identities is complex, and my very being at the best of times feels displaced. But here I am, a child of grace. Art, activism, education, medicine. These may seem like disjointed and separate vocations, but they are one and the same, through me. Under colonial capitalism, the sacredness of art has been reduced to its monetary value, a decoration, a collector's item, or a source of entertainment. And despite colonization's attempts to make us forget the functions of art, art's transformative power and inherent genius is hidden in plain sight. We only need to remember how to use it. That which comes from us is the very thing that will free us. I think those of us who are here today know this to be true. We wouldn't be here otherwise. In many cultures, and the cultures of my African ancestors, art is medicine. It's a mirror to our spirituality, a portal to other realms of knowing, and reminds us not only of who we are, but of our potential. It documents our history, it shapes our consciousness, guides our imagination, and is a channel for creativity, which is our birthright. Art is alchemy. Art is the great healer that allows us to transmute rather than transmit our trauma. So, what does it mean when healing, history, spirituality, consciousness, potential, and birthright of some are privileged over that of others? I was graciously invited to speak today because of a blog post I wrote entitled "The Problem with Diversity and Inclusion in Arts and Culture Nonprofit," where I spoke about my experiences while serving as a director on the board of the BC Alliance for Arts and Culture, a government-funded art service organization. Initially, I was drawn to serve on the board as I had noted that people who sit on boards are people who sit on boards, and I was connected to communities of artists who were generally excluded from the spaces where decisions that directly affected us were being made. My intention wasn't to be a representative per se, but an advocate of needs of those who weren't being invited to the conversation about how public resources were being allocated. An inroad, so to speak. I was the only Black member of the board and the only independent working artist. Over a period of 7 months, I witnessed and was the target of anti-Black racism perpetuated by my colleagues following an external formal complaint about the executive director's racial aggression while representing the organization. After pushing for accountability and consequences, the president and executive made me a target and scapegoat, framing me as the problem and not addressing the ED's behavior. I was excluded from meetings, accused of my involvement in meetings being a conflict of interest, targeted in private phone calls and emails, gaslit, and repeatedly referred to in correspondence as separate from the board, presumably to strip me of any rights I had as a director. Even after the president's admission that the organization is not a safe environment for BIPOC arts leaders, the abuse increased. When I continued to stand up for my rights as a board member, the executive hired legal counsel to intimidate and attempt to enforce my exclusion, which they legally could not, resulting in the irresponsible, unnecessary spending of what I estimate to be several thousands of dollars of public funds. After those traumatizing 7 months of trying to work within the systems in place to seek justice at the expense of my own health, I finally reached my breaking point and resigned. My essay or blog post paralleled some of my previous experiences of racism working in the arts and culture sectors, as well as the experiences of my colleagues who were willing to share, although the majority did not feel safe to do so. I spoke about the ways that provincial arts councils and other funding bodies perpetuate anti-Blackness and how the sector protects abusers rather than supporting survivors of abuse. If you want to read the blog post, it was published on Medium and it can easily be found with a Google search. Full disclosure, my decision to go public was not without fear. There were many sleepless nights and anxiety attacks. Despite the boldness of my words, I was fully aware of the risks to my safety if I spoke out, and the idea of that level of vulnerability was terrifying. At the end of the day, I knew that as a volunteer who doesn't rely solely on income from the arts sector anymore to meet my basic needs, I was in a position of privilege compared to others. The more people speak up, the more people speak up, and it was my time. I know that I will likely never be able to sit on another core-funded arts board again or get another JOB job in the sector, but to be honest, I wasn't being fulfilled trying to navigate that world anyway. It was never meant for me. Surviving in arts admin meant allowing others to tokenize my identity in the name of diversity and inclusion, and longevity was contingent on how much abuse I was able to withstand. None of that aligns with my life's work. And now that I'm out the other side of that mess, I can see how trying to fit in was holding me back from my authenticity. I am an artist, an activist, an educator, and a medicine maker. I am not a token. I'm not a scapegoat. I'm not a qualifier. I received a lot of feedback about my blog post. Several people contacted me through email and DMs to share with me their experiences, telling me that they felt seen and heard. For context, I live on the West Coast, and this conference is being held from Toronto, so that just goes to show how quickly it traveled. Yay, internet! I didn't, and still don't, expect that the organizations or individuals I referenced in my blog will face any consequences for their actions, because the people adjacent to power in those situations continue to uphold the status quo. Although I have hope that allies will push for justice, this current hegemony we live under lacks adequate processes to create lasting change and safety for people facing oppression to be full participants in the sector under colonial paradigms and funding models. The people in positions of power continue to benefit, and the trickle-down approaches to funding continue to privilege those at the top, while those at the bottom are fighting for the scraps. Even though I don't expect things will change as a result of my actions, I still have hope. My intention for writing what I wrote is that if any people who have experienced tokenism, racism, and abuse read my blog, they will know that their inability to receive justice is not about them and that they are not alone. I wish someone had told me that a long time ago. I have been an arts professional in various capacities over the past 2 decades, and I've seen the same dynamics of white supremacy and racial oppression play out over and over and over again. My words and act of vulnerability resonated with a lot of people, and for that, I give thanks. I'm so glad that people of so many cultural identities felt that they connected with the words in my blog, but I'm concerned about the possible erasure of Blackness from my message. When it comes to light and shadow, Black is the opposite of white. However, one cannot exist without the other. Human beings are not the opposite of other human beings unless you label them arbitrarily and negate their humanity. In the case of race and racism, white is a metaphor for power, and Black is the absence of power. Sociologically speaking, anti-Blackness is foundational to white supremacy. To dismantle white supremacy, anti-Blackness must be abolished because they are one and the same. Racism is not a binary, but a caste system with Black on the bottom, white on the top, created by European colonial powers and validated by the creation of pseudoscientific myths that were eventually taught as fact. This isn't my speculation. This is well-documented European history. Google the name Johann Blumenbach if you want to go down that rabbit hole. This caste system is the basis of colorism that creates division among families, division in communities, and dictates access to resources. It's upheld by the very people it harms as they cling on to whatever power they think they have and they are afraid to lose. It's a sick and brilliant divide and conquer tactic that sustains itself. The term BIPOC, which stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color, was coined by African American academics to highlight the interdependence and unique relationship to white supremacy of Black and Indigenous people on Turtle Island under colonial occupation. That relationship shapes the experiences of racism for all people of color. In arts nonprofit, too often do I see the term BIPOC used to describe groups of racialized people, even when the B and the I are absent. Those folks existing in between racial power polarities experience varying levels of privilege due to proximity to whiteness. And I have seen that proximity weaponized to further marginalize Black people, having them come in as consultants or panelists or speakers, visitors, but rarely integral to decision-making or in leadership roles, unless the organizations are for Black people specifically. All this to say, white people need not be present for white supremacy to prevail. I'm not ignorant to my own privilege being a light-skinned Black woman and the access that my proximity to whiteness affords me. Privilege in itself is neither good nor bad, it just means access. How one chooses to use that access is the defining piece. I do my best to keep this top of mind when speaking about race and racism, but I'm not perfect. I'm also a person with bias, and I'm learning too. Disrupting anti-Blackness is not only for the benefit of those who are labeled as Black people, but for the benefit of all who are harmed under white supremacy, which is rooted in exploitation, domination, and oppression. The opposite of that is nurturance, freedom, and liberation. Defiance of a violent status quo by speaking truth to power is a radical, disruptive act. Embracing the concept of Black is beautiful is a radical, disruptive act. So revolution is possible, but it means putting our energy into nurturing healthy systems rather than trying to reform toxic ones. Luckily, we don't have to figure this out from scratch. Black freedom fighters, artists, thought leaders, and academics have paved the way for discourse about liberation from racial oppression. From Marcus and Amy Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois, to Angela Davis, to James Baldwin, to Kimberly Williams Crenshaw and the development of critical race theory, to Ta-Nehisi Coates, to Audre Lorde, to El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, commonly referred to as Malcolm X, to the warrior and emancipator Harriet Tubman. The community organizing and defiant existence of Marsha P. Johnson, the wise, elegant leadership of Emperor Haile Selassie I, to the liberationist rebel music of Bob Marley and Nina Simone, the uncageable truth-telling of Mumia Abu-Jamal and Assata Shakur, the brilliant visual storytelling of Ava DuVernay, defiant and elegant freedom songs of Miriam Makeba and Fela Kuti. These wisdom keepers and many more are my teachers. We can honor them by being living examples of their teachings. Their pivotal, important, groundbreaking work and their willingness to sacrifice their freedom and safety and their very lives for truth is evidence of the lengths that those deemed as powerless will go to liberate all of us from the bondage of racism. So, where does anti-racism fit into diversity and inclusion? One movie from my childhood that really creeped me out was Disney's 1985 film Return to Oz. In this movie, Aunt Em and Uncle Henry think Dorothy's stories of Oz are indications of mental illness. They send her to a psychiatric hospital for electroshock therapy when, don't worry, this actually is going somewhere. The hospital is struck by lightning and Dorothy escapes, finding herself back in Oz, facing a new villain, Princess Mombi. Mombi is an evil sorceress with a collection of heads and glass domes, which she can attach and detach from her body depending on her mood. No matter which head she puts on, which face she wears, she is still the same evil Mombi. The Mombi metaphor comes to mind when I think of common approaches to diversity and inclusion initiatives, which often look like tokenized hires, delegating racialized people into roles of diversity officers with no real influence, posting solidarity statements and trendy woke hashtags to social media, inviting Indigenous artists to conduct land acknowledgements while there is an absence of Indigenous board or staff members, and putting brown-skinned faces on public-facing marketing assets. Changing the face of the organization may create the appearance of change, But underneath, it's still the same evil mombi. Nonprofit was designed to be exclusive, and generally speaking, those who are able to rise to positions of power can do so because they have access to navigate the system, not necessarily because they want to shift it as dismantling it would be in direct opposition to their power. Credentialing the heads of organizations operating within an oppressive structure by sending them for diversity training does not address inequity. It just further obscures it, puts a stamp of approval on it, so to speak. Until we move away from hierarchical governance models and create avenues for accountability and transformation, we're just putting a new head on the same evil mombi. Diversity and inclusion cannot be realized unless we first have healing and justice. Which brings us back to the function of art as a healing modality. Art is medicine. As artists, we have a sacred role in shaping global consciousness. We who gather here this week for this conference have roots from all around the world. We bring the ancestral wisdom, genius, and medicine we carry in our songs, dances, prayers, rhythms, and melodies. This past year has been transformative in so many ways, and we now find ourselves at the threshold of a new chapter of the human story. We have the power to create what's to come, and those who are stewards of art have a sacred and pivotal role in co-creating this new phase of being. We have the power to welcome a new reality in a time when truths are being revealed and old systems built on shaky foundations are imploding. First, however, we surrender what no longer serves us and heal from those wounds. Old paradigms of divide and dominate don't work and won't work. It's time for change. As the brilliant, elegant writer James Baldwin said, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." Sometimes facing truth and expanding our perception can be uncomfortable and even painful, but that discomfort is an invitation to grow, to evolve, and to ascend deeper into a new level of relationship with ourselves and one another, human and non-human beings. Art is the medicine that can transmute rather than transmit our trauma. Reclaim art as sacred medicine and approach it with both hands open, both to give and receive. Surrendering to healing as a vehicle for justice is decolonial, is liberationist, is anti-racist, is abolitionist, and is totally badass. Give thanks.